APUSH Period 8 Exam Cram from 1945 to 1980, from post-World War II to the Reagan years. This time period began with the Yalta Conference. This was a conference between Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, so the main Allied powers, in an attempt to get Russian support in the invasion of Japan, which was coming up at the end of World War II. The USSR, or the Soviet Union, controlled an area known as the Iron Curtain. This was mainly Eastern Europe, and they heavily promoted communism in this area. Eventually, a strategist known as George F. Kennedy started to promote the Containment Doctrine, which eventually became the Truman Doctrine. This simply said that the U.S. had to contain communism, such as that spread in the Iron Curtain, and prevent it from getting around to the rest of the world. Eventually, from this conference, the United Nations was also formed after the war. So during this time, a Cold War came about after World War II. It was mainly between the two remaining superpowers after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was fought during this time, and as mentioned before, an Iron Curtain had descended. It was basically a statement by Churchill saying the USSR had kind of shielded themselves from the rest of the world in capitalism. During this time, there was also the Berlin airlift, where what happened was the Soviet Union had blockaded the city of Berlin, which was the capital of Germany at the time, and so the Allies actually controlled West Berlin. In order to get supplies in past the blockade, they had to fly things in because the Soviets had blocked all the roads and entrances during this time. Tensions were really heating up between these two superpowers during this time. The Truman Doctrine, as mentioned before, started to be applied to places such as Greece, Turkey, and even later Korea, where communism was really trying to spread to these areas. The Marshall Plan was also in an attempt to try to tone down the tensions during this time of war. The Marshall Plan was a big aid package for different areas, primarily in Europe. These areas could take this aid package to use to rebuild their different countries. And the ideology was that if these countries took American aid, they would be less likely to fall to Soviet communism. Eventually, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was also created to try to form alliance against the Soviet Union and their allies. The Soviets had formed the Warsaw Pact in response to this, and these were the two main military alliances following World War II. Americans during this time lived in a big world of fear because, of course, atomic bombs had been used to end World War II. And so the National Security Act, or NSC 68, sought to quell some of these fears. It talked about the Korean crisis, but also suggested that the U.S. should spend a lot of their gross national product, or basically their economic productivity, to aid in their defense. This really escalated the Cold War because the Soviet Union didn't want to be outspent by the United States, and they started to build up their arms as well. During this time, there were also fears of communism spreading to the United States, and this gave rise to McCarthyism, which was named after a Republican senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. He was strongly against communism, and he claimed that there were many communists in the State Department in the federal government. But he didn't have much evidence for these accusations, but nonetheless, he started a big witch hunt and in the House of Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, which really sought to find these people. Sooner or later, though, the American public realized maybe this was just a big shot for fame that wasn't actually true, and he soon wasn't able to continue his claims much longer. However, spies such as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and people like Alger Hiss proved that communist spies did exist in the United States. A young representative from California named Richard Nixon actually helped to prosecute Hiss. Hiss eventually was jailed, while the Rosenbergs were actually convicted and executed. During the Truman administration following World War II, there were also different business deals. One was the Taft-Hartley Act. This act weakened trade unions and also outlawed the closed shop, so businesses open only to union members. This also began the decline in unions and membership in unions. So following the act of this passage, different businesses could hire whatever workers they wanted. So workers didn't necessarily have to join a union, and different businesses didn't have to support unions anymore. He also promoted the Fair Deal. This was created in 1949, and it tried to improve different types of things in America, such as housing, employment, and the minimum wage, and help farmers as well. It also tried to extend Social Security, which of course was started by FDR in the decade before. It was basically an extension of the New Deal. Dwight D Eisenhower was the next president, and he started modern republicanism. He was a war hero, and he actually directed troops in the D-Day invasion in World War II. His most notable accomplishment was the interstate highway system, a long series of highways across the United States that really didn't exist in the rest of the world. He also was a bit more progressive on social issues. For example, he helped to promote integration and desegregation of schools. Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education case to the Supreme Court actually happened during his time. And even though he didn't openly support it, he helped make sure it was enforced. So with the Little Rock Nine and desegregating schools in Arkansas, he really sent the National Guard in to try to make sure the Supreme Court case was enacted. By the end of his term, though, there were many issues. One was the military-industrial complex, where the military and the industrial power of the United States was really tied together. And this was bad because in order for industry to really thrive, military had to use more weapons and use more force. And of course, war is kind of bad for the world. So this was a big dilemma that the American public was facing in the coming years, the appropriate balance between military and the growth of industry. The space race started during this time as well, when the Soviet Union launched a satellite known as the Sputnik. This spurred American education to try to focus more on science and math, and the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, was also created to try to pull America back in front of the Soviets again. There were also military issues, for example, the U-2 incident. This took place during the administration where a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russia. It was supposedly just gathering weather information, but the Soviets certainly didn't think so. So Dwight D. Eisenhower certainly created many great domestic programs for America, but the space race and the Cold War really heated up during this time with the Soviets. The next president was John F. Kennedy Jfk. He was the youngest president ever elected at the time and was also Catholic. He really tried to tone down the tensions in the Cold War. So he tried to avoid a war with the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union tried to ship missiles to Cuba to potentially launch them onto America. This showdown with the Soviet Union really showed that he was not going to back down, but it was also basically the closest time the two superpowers came to war. JFK successfully used the Navy to defuse this situation. He also represented a new shift in the Democratic Party with his New Frontier platform. This was a bunch of domestic issues that were not passed. He was also a major contributor to the space program, and he really wanted to put a man on Mars, which would be accomplished by the end of this decade. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and his ideas for the civil rights movement didn't really come to fruition. Before Kennedy had died, though, he had helped to sign a nuclear test ban treaty, which scaled down the arms race to a smaller degree. After his assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, became president, and he was very progressive on civil rights. He helped to pass legislation such as the 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Acts. The 65 one was better known as the Voting Rights Act, to try to gain more equal access for people to vote. He also helped to start a war on poverty, which really was combined with his Great Society plan. The Great Society was really the New Frontier platform coming to life. It really helped to help the poor people in America, usually those living in Appalachia, so like West Virginia, who were really struggling after World War II. They didn't have many of the material comforts other Americans had. The Immigration Acts and Nationality Act of 1965 was also passed under Johnson. This allowed for the end of the restrictive immigration acts of the 1920s, and this allowed for a new merit-based system where people were admitted to the U.S. based on their skills, not necessarily race anymore. This really helped to promote immigration from different parts of the world. The biggest part of Johnson, however, was probably Vietnam. So he escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam. There were many problems that he ran into early on. So shots were allegedly fired at American Navy ships by the North Vietnamese, and so LBJ didn't like this, and he tried to raid North Vietnamese bases and push for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This was known as the blank check from Congress. This basically gave the president the ability to use any force in Southeast Asia needed to quell the communists, and this drastically escalated the Vietnamese conflict. Also, a few years later was the Tet Offensive. In January of 1968, so the Tet, which was the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong attacked many South Vietnamese cities and military bases of the United States. Well, Americans really didn't like this, and so they escalated even more, and they destroyed many North American bases in retaliation. Well, even though this was good for the American military, the American public really did not like this, and they didn't like that the U.S. was really being pushed to its limits, and this eventually led to massive demonstrations. Many of the massive demonstrations came from the youth counterculture at this time, so the baby boomers were growing up during this time, and they were in their 20s, and they really started to see the world in a different way. They didn't really like Vietnam, and they wanted peace. And many times to do this, they took radical measures such as take drugs and smoke weed. Do not condone. But anyways, this youth counterculture really came to be a major driving force in trying to end the war in Vietnam. The civil rights movement really developed during the 60s, and eventually, as mentioned before, this helped to pass the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. There were many different leaders. The most notable were, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., who promoted nonviolence, and Malcolm X, who promoted Black power, using whatever means necessary to gain equal power. So Martin Luther King Jr. was basically the main leader of this movement. He organized a March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. This had a lot of people, and it really helped to catapult this civil rights movement onto a national stage. Also, another important person was Stokely Carmichael. He helped to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really helped to promote the youth movement in trying to gain civil rights as well. In 1968, however, both Martin Luther King Jr. and RFK, who was a political presidential candidate, and JFK's younger brother were assassinated, and this really put a dampening effect on all the major gains in freedom during this era. You should check out my civil rights video if you want a more detailed explanation. Following the liberalization and progressive movements of the 60s, many Americans, known as the silent majority, wanted a return to many conservative ideals, so they turned to the Republican Richard Nixon, who you remember from prosecuting communists earlier. So Richard Nixon really based his platform on trying to serve these people who wanted more conservative ideals back in American culture. However, by the time of his second administration, he ran into some trouble, especially from Daniel Ellsberg and the CIA, who had published the Pentagon Papers, which kind of explain what the Nixon administration had done during the end of the Vietnam crisis. And Nixon really didn't like to be exposed to the public like this. There were also issues, one which was Watergate, where members of his re-election committee had actually broken into the Democratic Convention to try to wiretap the Democratic opponent who was going against him. He was convicted by Congress for trying to cover up this break-in, and as a result, instead of being impeached, he decided to resign as well, the only president to resign in U.S. history. So then his vice president took over, Gerald Ford, but he wasn't able to do much following this national crisis. He pardoned Nixon, but that's basically all he did. He faced a lot of stagflation, which was high inflation, and also high stagnation of the economy, so the economy wasn't growing. And this was causing a lot of problems for America during this time. The next president was Jimmy Carter, and he was from Georgia. He tried to base his platform on clean politics, so away from the corruption in Washington. However, he was soon hit hard by international economics. For example, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, hit America with an oil embargo for trying to help out Israel. And other issues arose during this time as well, because many of the OPEC countries were from the Middle East, and they had conflicts with Israel, which was a Jewish state. By the end of the Carter administration, he also faced the Iran hostage crisis, where Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 had started the Iranian Revolution and had disposed of the Shah the U.S. put in during the Eisenhower administration. This ultimately led to American embassy being taken over and American hostages being taken, and Carter tried to save them using a rescue attempt, but that rescue attempt failed. And so many Americans thought Carter was being ineffective. Also, stagflation was still high. And so following Carter was the election of Ronald Reagan, which is really modern conservatism, like actual real conservatism as we see it today. Ronald Reagan was an actor from California, and he tried to base his platform on two main things: lowering taxes and also lowering federal spending. He did the first one, but the second one wasn't quite successful because he spent a lot of money to try to defeat the Soviet Union in the space race. For example, he tried to promote the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. This was like a high-tech anti-nuclear missile defense system, is kind of nicknamed Star Wars because different satellites were supposed to be launched into space to try to shoot down Russian nuclear missiles if they ever came. This apparently was scientifically impossible, even though it sounds cool, and cost a lot of money in research. However, his conservatism really shifted to try to go against many of the liberalization policies before. So he was anti-affirmative action. Affirmative action tried to give minorities more chances in the United States. And he also really got the votes of the Sun Belt. So the Sun Belt were voters of the southern parts of the United States who were still recovering from all the different changes that had happened to their society and culture since the big civil rights movement of the 60s. Despite conservatism, women's rights really grew during this time as well. So Betty Friedan was a feminist and a big promoter of women's rights, and she published The Feminist Mystique, which really called for women during this time to take on roles both inside the home and outside the home. The Equal Rights Amendment was also trying to be passed during this time, but ultimately it failed because even though it passed through both houses of Congress, not enough states ratified it to become an amendment. The sexual revolution also started big during this time. The growth of the birth control pill and other different types of contraception eventually allowed women and men to have more control over their bodies and reproductive rights. The battle for reproductive rights ultimately came to a big court case known as Roe v. Wade, debating the different effects of abortion. People were trying to debate whether abortion was legal in the U.S. or not, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that it was. Despite this, different organizations such as the Environmental Protection Agency, created during the Nixon administration, and organizations such as the National Organization of Women, created by Betty Friedan, really helped to promote more progressive ideals during this time. Environmental protection, of course, was a big one, and the EPA sought to provide more environmental protection for different areas across the United States. Basically, the biggest environmental movement since Teddy Roosevelt early in the 1900s. This act was very heavily influenced by the publishing of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which really opened Americans' eyes to the devastating effects of not protecting the environment. So this has been Period 8 Exam Cram Review. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe and share these videos with your friends if you haven't already, and see you in Period 9.